I'm done playing games. Step out of the vehicle. Now.
That won't be necessary, Sheriff. Just run my license.
No, it can't be.
The dust was the first offense. It rose in a defiant plume, a tan-colored flag of intrusion against the crisp, blue Montana sky. Sheriff Mark Thorne watched it from the crest of the hill, his hand resting possessively on the hood of his gleaming white patrol SUV. The vehicle was new, top of the line, just like everything else in Aspen Creek County. This was a place of quiet money, of sprawling ranches owned by CEOs and celebrities who came here to escape the noise of the world. Thorne saw himself not just as a lawman, but as the gatekeeper of that tranquility. His job was to maintain the pristine, undisturbed order of things, and that plume of dust, kicked up by the tires of a battered, rust-pocked Ford F-150, was a direct violation of that order. The truck was old, maybe from the late 90s. Its original forest green paint faded to a dull moss and scarred with the kind of dents and scrapes that told a long story of hard labor. It was moving slowly, but with a purpose, down the newly paved access road that led into the heart of the old Henderson property, a massive, 10,000-acre expanse of rolling hills and untouched forest that had just been sold. The private property, no trespassing signs were brand new, their stark white lettering practically gleaming in the midday sun. Thorne's jaw tightened. He knew every ranch hand, every contractor, every legitimate worker in a 50-mile radius. He didn't recognize that truck. It didn't belong. It was a piece of junk, something you'd see parked outside a rundown bar in the next county over, not cruising through the most exclusive real estate in the state. To Thorne, it was a symbol of decay, a threat. The driver was probably some local yokel looking to poach deer, or worse, scoping the place out for a robbery, assuming the new owner hadn't moved in yet. "Not on my watch," Thorne muttered to himself. He was 35, with a military-style haircut that was sharp and severe. He had been elected sheriff 2 years ago on a tough-on-crime platform, promising the wealthy residents that their peaceful sanctuary would remain untroubled. He took that promise personally. He could have radioed one of his deputies. He had 2 on patrol. But this felt different. This felt like a personal affront. He wanted to handle it himself. He wanted to look the driver in the eye and deliver the message that this kind of casual disregard for boundaries would not be tolerated. He got back into his SUV, the new leather creaking under his weight. He didn't turn on his sirens. That would be too disruptive. He just flipped on the light bar. The silent, flashing reds and blues, a stark, urgent pulse in the peaceful landscape. He coasted down the hill, his vehicle eating up the distance with a smooth, powerful glide that was the complete opposite of the Ford's lumbering progress. The old truck pulled over immediately, its worn-out suspension sighing as it settled onto the gravel shoulder. Perfect compliance. Too perfect. In Thorne's experience, that often meant the person had something to hide. He parked his SUV about 15 feet back, angling it to the left. His spotlight aimed squarely at the driver's side mirror. Standard procedure. It maximized his safety and the other driver's disadvantage. Before we go any further into this confrontation, a confrontation that would unravel a man's career and change the very fabric of this community, I need you to do something. If you believe that a person should be judged by their character, not by the car they drive, hit that subscribe button. You are not going to want to miss the moment the tables turn on this sheriff in a way he could never have imagined. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us shine a light on these important stories. Thorne took a deep, centering breath. He unholstered his Glock, holding it low against his thigh, a habit born of caution. He stepped out of the SUV, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. The sun was warm on his back. The air smelled of pine and clean earth. It was a beautiful day, a day he was about to ruin for someone. He approached the truck with a measured, confident stride, his eyes scanning the interior, looking for movement, for weapons, for any sign of a threat. He saw a man's silhouette, a baseball cap pulled down low, a worn flannel shirt. The man's hands were on the steering wheel, exactly where they should be, still. Thorne's senses were on high alert. This was a hunt, and he was the predator. He stopped just behind the driver's door, forcing the man to turn to look at him. "Roll your window down," he commanded, his voice a sharp bark that cut through the mountain silence. The window didn't glide down smoothly like his own. It lowered with a reluctant, grinding squeak operated by a hand crank, a relic, just like the truck itself. To understand the colossal miscalculation Sheriff Thorne was making, you first have to understand the man sitting in that driver's seat. His name was Julian Croft, and while that name meant nothing to Thorne, in the worlds of software, artificial intelligence, and global logistics, it was the equivalent of a king's. Julian Croft was a ghost, a myth in the tech industry. He had founded his company, Nexus Dynamics, in his college dorm room with two friends, 15 years later. It was a titan, its predictive algorithms and data management systems forming the invisible backbone of modern commerce. He had become a billionaire before he was 30, but unlike his peers who bought yachts, private islands, and social media companies, Julian had recoiled from the spotlight. He hated the galas, the magazine covers, the endless profiles that tried to dissect him like a lab specimen. He was a builder, a problem solver. He was most comfortable in front of a whiteboard filled with complex equations or a screen filled with lines of code. The world of high finance and celebrity was a distraction, a noise that interfered with his signal. He dressed not to make a statement, but for comfort and utility. His daily uniform consisted of worn-in jeans, soft cotton t-shirts, and a rotation of faded baseball caps. He looked less like a CEO and more like a carpenter or a mechanic. His hands, though they had typed the code that managed billions of dollars in assets, were calloused from his other passion, working with his hands. He restored old furniture, tinkered with engines, and spent his weekends building things from wood and steel. This truck, the old Ford F-150, was perhaps his most prized possession. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had been a farmer in Nebraska, a man who believed that wealth was measured in acres of healthy soil and the strength of your word. Julian had spent his childhood summers in this truck, bouncing along dusty farm roads, learning about crop rotation and the quiet dignity of hard work. When his grandfather passed away, the truck was the only thing he wanted. To him, it wasn't a piece of junk. It was a connection to his roots, a reminder of a simpler, more honest way of life. It was his escape from the sterile, glass and steel world he now inhabited. The 10,000-acre Henderson property wasn't just an investment for him. It was a sanctuary. He had bought it under a shell corporation to avoid the media frenzy that would inevitably follow such a purchase. His plan wasn't to build another golf course or a gated community of mansions. He was going to turn it into the largest private nature preserve in the state. He was reintroducing native species, restoring wetlands, and building a small, self-sustaining research facility dedicated to environmental science. He wanted to give the land back to nature, to create a place of silence and wild beauty. He had driven out from California himself, taking 2 days to enjoy the journey in his grandfather's truck. He had just finalized the last of the paperwork that morning, and this was his first time setting foot on the property as its official owner. He was filled with a quiet sense of joy and purpose. He was driving down the main access road, not to poach or to cause trouble, but to find the perfect spot for the research cabin he planned to build with his own hands. The dust his tires were kicking up wasn't a mark of disrespect. It was the first sign of a new beginning, a homecoming. He saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and felt a familiar, weary sigh. He knew what the sheriff saw. He'd seen that look 100 times. He saw an old truck where it didn't belong. He saw a man in work clothes in a place reserved for cashmere and loafers. He had been followed in high-end stores, questioned by security guards in his own office building, and looked down upon by people who had no idea they were using his software on their phones every single day. It no longer angered him. It just made him a little sad for a world so quick to judge a book by its worn, dusty cover. He placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained from years of being profiled. He waited patiently. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a man in his grandfather's truck, on his own land. And he had a feeling this was going to be a very, very long conversation. "What do you think you're doing here, buddy?" Thorne asked. The word buddy was coded in condescension, the kind of term used to put someone in their place, to establish dominance from the very first sentence. He leaned against the truck's door frame, his presence filling the open window, blocking out the sun. The smell of gun oil and aggressive, pine-scented air freshener filled the cab. Julian Croft turned his head slowly. He didn't offer a nervous smile or a torrent of excuses. He simply looked at the sheriff, his blue eyes calm and steady. "Just taking a look around." "Sheriff," he replied, his voice even and polite. He glanced at the nameplate on the officer's chest. "M. Thorne." He made a mental note. "Taking a look around?" Thorne scoffed, a small, humorless laugh. "This is private property. Can't you read? There are signs posted every 50 feet. "Yes, sir." "I saw them," Julian said. "They're very well placed." The complete lack of fear or apology in the man's tone was like sandpaper on Thorne's nerves. He was used to people being intimidated. He expected stammering, profuse apologies, maybe a little begging. This man's placid demeanor felt like a challenge. It felt like disrespect. Thorne saw it as the arrogance of a lowlife who thought he could get away with anything. "So you saw the signs, and you just decided they didn't apply to you? Is that it?" Thorne pressed, his voice getting louder. "What's your excuse? You lost? Following a bad GPS?" "No, sir. I know exactly where I am," Julian said, his hands still resting peacefully on the wheel. This guy is a real smart aleck, Thorne thought. The fury inside him began to simmer, a low heat that was clouding his judgment. He needed to find a reason, a legitimate infraction, to justify this stop and the escalation he was already planning. He couldn't just say, "I pulled you over because your truck is old. I clocked you doing close to 40 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone back there." Thorne lied, pulling a vague accusation out of thin air. "And you took that last turn pretty wide. Looked like you were driving erratically. Have you been drinking today?" It was a classic fishing expedition. Throw out a bunch of accusations and see what sticks. Hope the driver gets flustered and admits to something. Anything. But Julian didn't get flustered. "I don't believe I was..." "Sheriff," he said calmly. "My speedometer is pretty accurate for an old truck, and I was keeping it under 20. I haven't had anything to drink. I'd be happy to take a breathalyzer test if you'd like." The offer to take the test, made so willingly, completely deflated Thorne's accusation. A guilty man would have argued. A guilty man would have looked nervous. This man was acting like he had all the time in the world, like this was a minor inconvenience he was patiently tolerating. It was infuriating. This is a psychological phenomenon you see in individuals whose authority is deeply tied to their ego, when their authority is questioned, even by a calm, factual response. They don't see it as a misunderstanding. They see it as a direct attack on their identity, and they almost always double down. "I'll be the judge of what I saw," Thorne snapped, his hand drifting closer to the handle of his Glock. "Now, let me see your license and registration. And you better hope they're in order." "Of course," Julian said. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The inevitable demand that would, in any sane world, end this ridiculous encounter. "My wallet is in my back pocket, and the registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them now. Is that okay with you, Sheriff?" He narrated his movements, a sad but necessary script he had learned over the years. He moved slowly, deliberately. He could feel the sheriff's eyes on him, burning with suspicion. Thorne was coiled like a snake, just waiting for a reason to strike. He had no idea the man he was treating like a common criminal could buy this entire county and turn it into a parking lot if he felt like it. He had no idea that the trespasser he was harassing owned the very ground on which his patrol SUV was parked. And he had no idea that his career was hanging by a thread. And he himself was about to take a pair of scissors and snip it. Julian retrieved the registration from the glove box first. It was a folded, slightly worn document tucked into a small plastic sleeve along with the insurance card. He handed it out the window. Thorne snatched it from his hand. He glanced at it, his eyes scanning for any discrepancy. The vehicle was registered to one Julian Croft, with an address in Palo Alto, California. "California, huh?" Thorne said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Long way from home, aren't you? What's your business in my county?" "My business is my own." "Sheriff," Julian replied, his politeness starting to wear thin, replaced by a cool, precise tone. "Is my presence here in violation of a specific statute other than the one you've already invented about my speeding?" That was it. The final straw. The calm, intellectual challenge had broken through Thorne's shield of authority. It was no longer about a traffic stop or trespassing. It was about who was in control. Thorne couldn't allow this man in a beat-up truck to question him, to imply he was a liar. The rage that had been simmering boiled over. "You've got a real attitude problem. You know that?" Thorne snarled. "Answering my questions with questions, acting all high and mighty. I'm starting to think there's a reason you're being so evasive." He handed the registration back. "I'm done playing games. Step out of the vehicle, now." The command was a clear and unambiguous escalation. Under the law, an officer can order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. But this stop wasn't lawful. It was based on a pretext, a lie about speeding. The order wasn't for officer safety. Julian had been nothing but compliant. This was a power play. It was an act of dominance. Thorne wanted to get this man out of his truck, to make him stand on the side of the road, to frisk him, to humiliate him, to show him who was boss. Julian looked at the sheriff. He saw the anger in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand. He saw a man who had lost control of the situation and was now resorting to brute force and intimidation to get it back. He could have argued. He could have quoted case law, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Thorne was beyond reason. Arguing would only be twisted into resisting. "Sheriff, there is no legal basis for this order," Julian stated, his voice clear and firm. For the record, he knew Thorne was likely wearing a body camera, and he was now speaking to a future audience, a judge, a jury, an internal affairs investigator. "This is not a lawful stop, and this is an unlawful command. However, I am complying under duress because I fear for my safety." He unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped out onto the gravel. He was taller than Thorne, but leaner. He stood straight, his hands held away from his body, open and visible. He didn't slouch. He didn't look at the ground. He looked Sheriff Thorne directly in the eye, his expression unreadable. The sight of the man standing there, unafraid and unbowed, only fueled Thorne's anger. He wanted this man to cower. He needed it. "Turn around! Hands on the side of the truck! Now!" he barked. Julian turned slowly and placed his hands on the dusty, sun-warmed metal of the truck bed. The posture was demeaning, designed to make a person feel like a criminal. He could feel the eyes of the sheriff on his back, could feel the heat of his fury. "Spread your feet!" Thorne commanded, kicking the inside of Julian's boot to force his legs apart. The contact was unnecessary, a petty act of physical assertion. "That's enough." "Sheriff," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'll tell you when it's enough," Thorne grunted. He began a pat-down, his hands moving roughly over Julian's clothes. A frisk like this, a Terry frisk, legally requires a reasonable suspicion that the person is armed and dangerous. Julian was a man in a flannel shirt and jeans who had been polite and compliant. There was zero basis for it. This was assault under the color of law. Thorne was punishing him for his defiance, for his refusal to be intimidated. "You know, Sheriff," Julian said, his voice muffled as his face was close to the truck. "Every action you've taken since you pulled me over has been illegal. You are stripping yourself of qualified immunity with every move you make." The legal phrase, qualified immunity, hung in the air. It was a term most civilians didn't know. It momentarily pierced Thorne's rage. "What? Are you some kind of jailhouse lawyer?" he mocked, but a seed of doubt had been planted. "Think you're smart?" "I just need your license." "Sheriff, it's in my back right pocket," Julian said. "Then you and I can have a much more detailed conversation about the law." Thorne reached into Julian's back pocket and pulled out the wallet. It wasn't the kind of wallet he was used to seeing in this county. No Gucci or Louis Vuitton. It was simple, worn leather, softened with age, the corners frayed. It looked like the wallet of a working man. He opened it, his fingers fumbling with a sense of angry vindication. He was going to find something, an expired license, a warrant, a fake ID. He had to. He pulled out the driver's license. It was a California license, the plastic slightly scuffed from years of being carried. The photo was a few years old, showing the same man who was now pressed against the side of the truck, but with slightly shorter hair. Thorne's eyes went straight to the name, printed in stark, official lettering, Croft. Julian Alexander Thorne stared at it. The name echoed in his mind, ringing a distant bell. Croft, Julian Croft. He'd seen that name before. In the newspaper? On a business channel his father-in-law always watched? He looked at the face in the photo, then at the back of the man's head. No, it couldn't be. That Julian Croft was some kind of tech genius, a billionaire, one of the richest men in the world. He lived in a futuristic glass house on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. Not this. Not a guy in a 30-year-old truck wearing a faded flannel shirt. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. His brain simply refused to connect the two realities. This had to be a joke, a fake. It was the only explanation that made sense, the only one that kept his worldview intact. A harsh, nervous laugh escaped Thorne's lips. "You've got to be kidding me!" he sputtered. "A fake ID? And you picked Julian Croft? You got real ambitious, didn't you, pal?" He waved the license in the air. "Impersonating someone is a felony. You just turned a trespassing ticket into serious prison time. You are one dumb son of a gun." Julian remained silent for a moment, letting the sheriff's words hang in the air, a testament to his spectacular ignorance. "Sheriff," he said, his voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "That is a government-issued, valid driver's license. That is my name. Now, I suggest you run it. Oh, I'll run it, Thorne sneered, his confidence returning. He was sure it would come back as a forgery, or that the real Julian Croft would have a flag on his file for identity theft. This was his gotcha moment. And when it comes back as fake, I'm going to enjoy putting you in the back of my car. He walked back to his SUV, still holding the license. He could feel his heart pounding. This was a big bust. He could see the headlines now. Sheriff Thorne apprehends identity thief impersonating billionaire. He sat in the driver's seat and began typing the name and date of birth into his patrol car's computer. As the system searched, a wave of doubt washed over him. The man had been so calm. Too calm. What if... No, it was impossible. He looked back at the man, who was now standing up straight, leaning casually against the side of his truck, his arms crossed. He was watching Thorne, his expression patient, as if he were waiting for a slow child to finish a simple math problem. The computer beeped. The results flashed on the screen. Croft, Julian Alexander, valid. No wants or warrants. Thorne stared at the screen. Valid. No warrants. It was real. His mind reeled. The system was linked to the DMV database. It was infallible. The man standing 30 feet away, the man he had just threatened, lied to, and assaulted, was, in fact, Julian Alexander Croft, the billionaire. Panic, hot and acidic, rose in his throat. Every action he had taken in the last 10 minutes replayed in his mind. But now they were cast in a terrifying new light. He hadn't pulled over a trespasser. He had illegally detained one of the most powerful men on the planet. He had lied to him. He had put his hands on him. He had kicked him. The potential consequences were astronomical. Lawsuits that would bankrupt the county. An end to his career. Public humiliation. But for a bully like Thorne, panic doesn't look like fear. It looks like aggression. He couldn't be wrong. He couldn't back down now. He had to be right. He convinced himself the ID was real. But the man was an imposter who had somehow stolen it. He had to salvage the situation. He got out of the car, his face a mask of false confidence. "All right, Mr. Croft," he said, the name feeling alien in his mouth. "The ID checks out, but I still don't believe it's you. You're coming with me." He pulled out his handcuffs. Just as Sheriff Thorne took a step toward Julian, his hand outstretched with the cold steel of the handcuffs, a new sound intruded on the scene. It was a low, powerful hum. The sound of expensive engines moving in perfect sync. Over the crest of the hill, where Thorne's own SUV had been parked just minutes before, a procession appeared. It wasn't one car, but three. Three identical black Cadillac Escalades with tinted windows, moving with the silent, imposing grace of a predator. They drove down the hill and pulled onto the gravel shoulder, forming a neat, intimidating line behind Thorne's patrol vehicle. The dust they kicked up was minimal, their heavy frames and wide tires hugging the road. For a moment, everyone was frozen. The Escalades were the kind of vehicles that belonged here. They radiated power, money, and importance. Doors opened on all three cars simultaneously. Men in sharply tailored suits stepped out, their expressions serious, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. From the lead vehicle, a man in his late 60s emerged. He had a full head of silver hair and wore a suit that probably cost more than Thorne's monthly salary. This was Arthur Davenport, the lead attorney for Croft's real estate holding company and a legendary figure in corporate law. "Julian, there you are," Davenport called out, his voice rich and authoritative. He walked toward Julian, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the same gravel Thorne had stood on. He completely ignored the sheriff, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. "We were told you'd be up here. The development team is ready for the walkthrough. I hope we're not late." Thorne stood there, handcuffs dangling from his fingers, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from the army of suits to Julian, who was now smiling for the first time. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was a weary, "I told you so" kind of smile. "No, Arthur, you're right on time," Julian said. "I was just having a chat with Sheriff Thorne here. He was concerned I might be trespassing." Davenport finally turned his gaze to Thorne. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He sized up the sheriff in a single sweeping glance, taking in the handcuffs, the aggressive posture, the panicked look in his eyes. "Trespassing?" Davenport said, raising a silver eyebrow. "Sheriff, this is Julian Croft. He owns this land. He owns everything from that ridge to the river. We finalized the purchase this morning. You are, in fact, the one who is currently trespassing on his private meeting." The world seemed to tilt under Sheriff Thorne's feet. The color drained from his face. The reality of the situation crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. It was true. All of it. The ID. The name. The man in the flannel shirt was the new landlord of 10,000 acres of prime Montana real estate. The men in suits weren't a threat. They were his employees, his lawyers, his team. I, Thorne stammered, his mind a blank wall of sheer terror. He fumbled with the handcuffs, shoving them back into their pouch on his belt as if they were red hot. "There was a report of a suspicious vehicle." "A report from whom?" Davenport asked, his voice cutting like a razor. "From you? Sheriff, did you or did you not order my client out of his vehicle? Did you place your hands on him?" One of the younger lawyers had already pulled out his phone and was discreetly recording the entire scene. Thorne knew it. He saw the small red light. He was trapped. The lie he had told. The force he had used. It was all about to be laid bare in front of the most powerful people in the county. "Sir, I was just following procedure," he began, his voice weak. "Whose procedure? Sheriff?" Julian Croft spoke up, his voice no longer calm and patient, but now imbued with an unyielding authority. "Because it certainly wasn't the law. You stopped me without cause. You lied about my speed. You conducted an illegal search, and you were about to unlawfully arrest me. Your body camera footage will confirm all of it. This meeting is over." He looked at Davenport. "Arthur, please get the captain of the state police and the attorney general on the phone. I want to file a formal complaint, and I want this man's badge." Thorne felt his legs go weak. The attorney general, the state police. This wasn't going to be a simple complaint filed with his own department, something that could be swept under the rug. This was going straight to the top. The men in suits stared at him, their expressions cold and unreadable. He was no longer a sheriff. He was a defendant. In less than 15 minutes, he had gone from the king of his county to a liability who was about to be sued into oblivion. He looked at Julian Croft, the billionaire in the worn-out denim, and for the first time, he saw him not as a trespasser, but as the man who had just ended his life as he knew it. The fallout was not swift. It was immediate. It was a lightning strike that bypassed the usual bureaucratic channels and hit with devastating force. Before Sheriff Thorne had even driven back to his office, his tail between his legs, Arthur Davenport had made the calls. The story of a rural sheriff illegally detaining one of the world's wealthiest men was too explosive to contain. The governor's office was aware of it by lunchtime. The state attorney general had opened a file by 3 o'clock. Thorne walked into his own precinct to find 2 stone-faced investigators from the state police waiting for him in his office. They weren't there to chat. They were there to collect his badge, his service weapon, and to inform him he was on administrative leave, effective immediately. They took his body camera, his patrol car's dash cam unit, and the computer from his vehicle. They were treating him like a suspect, because that's exactly what he was. But Julian Croft and his legal team weren't just interested in punishing one man. They understood that a weed like Thorne didn't grow in a healthy garden. His behavior was a symptom of a deeper disease. They wanted to know how he had become a sheriff. They wanted to know if he had done this before. The lawsuit they filed wasn't just against Mark Thorne, it was against Aspen Creek County and the Sheriff's Department itself, alleging a pattern of misconduct and negligent supervision. They launched their own investigation, hiring a team of private investigators, mostly ex-FBI agents, to dig into Thorne's past. What they found was both shocking and sadly predictable. Mark Thorne had been a problem officer long before he became a sheriff. In his previous job as a deputy in a neighboring, less affluent county, he had racked up an alarming number of citizen complaints. There were 5 official complaints for excessive force and over a dozen for verbal abuse and illegal stops. The pattern was always the same. Thorne would target people who looked like they didn't belong, people driving older cars, people of color, or anyone who simply looked poor. He would invent a minor traffic infraction, escalate the encounter with aggressive and demeaning language, and often end it with a resisting arrest charge when the person inevitably became frustrated or angry. To his superiors, it looked like he was a proactive, tough cop. But in reality, he was a bully with a badge, preying on those with the fewest resources to fight back. How did he get away with it? His previous supervisor had systematically buried the complaints, marking them all as unsubstantiated without a real investigation. Why? Because Thorne's aggressive tactics resulted in high arrest numbers, which made the department look good on paper. When the sheriff position opened up in the wealthy Aspen Creek County, this same supervisor had given Thorne a glowing recommendation, calling him a model officer. The affluent residents of Aspen Creek, eager for a tough-on-crime sheriff to protect their assets, had elected him without ever looking deeper. They had hired a wolf to guard the sheep. The state's investigation confirmed everything the PIS found, and then some. They pulled his traffic stop data from the past 2 years. Nearly 90% of his discretionary stops not related to a clear violation like speeding caught on radar, involved vehicles over 10 years old or drivers from outside the county. He had arrested more people for contempt of cop, minor, trumped-up charges like disorderly conduct or obstruction, than any other officer in the region. The body camera footage from the Croft incident was the nail in his coffin. It showed everything, just as Julian had predicted. It showed the lie about speeding. It showed the condescending tone. It showed the illegal order to exit the vehicle and the unwarranted physical search. It was a textbook case of abuse of authority. And the victim just happened to be a man with unlimited resources to ensure justice was served. The story broke in the national news. The county was embarrassed. The wealthy residents who had voted for Thorne were horrified to learn that their protector was a reckless liability. The press conference held by the county commissioners was a disaster. They tried to frame it as an isolated incident involving a single rogue officer. But Julian Croft's legal team immediately released their findings about Thorne's history, proving it was a systemic failure. The county hadn't just hired a bad apple, they had ignored a whole barrel of them. Mark Thorne was fired. The state began criminal proceedings against him for official oppression and false imprisonment. Facing overwhelming evidence, he took a plea deal, receiving probation and surrendering his law enforcement certification, meaning he could never be a cop again, anywhere in the country. He lost his job, his reputation, and his sense of identity. The man who saw himself as the ultimate authority figure had been brought down by his own arrogance. The legal battle was over almost before it began. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the county's insurers were desperate to settle. They knew that if this case went to a jury, the damages could be astronomical. They offered Julian Croft a multi-million-dollar settlement, but Julian wasn't interested in the money. He had never been interested in the money. He was interested in change. He instructed his legal team to negotiate a different kind of settlement. He waived any personal financial compensation. In its place, he demanded two things. First, the establishment of a permanent, independent civilian oversight committee for the Aspen Creek Sheriff's Department. This committee would have the power to review citizen complaints, access body camera footage, and make binding recommendations for disciplinary action. It would be comprised of local residents from all walks of life, not just the wealthy ranchers, ensuring that the department was accountable to the entire community it served, not just a select few. Second, he demanded the county use the settlement money, $5 million, to establish the Montana Legal Defense Fund. This non-profit organization would provide free, high-quality legal representation to any citizen in the state who believed their civil rights had been violated by law enforcement. He wanted to ensure that the next person who was illegally stopped and harassed by an officer like Mark Thorne wouldn't have to be a billionaire to get justice. They would have access to the same caliber of legal firepower that he did. The county, eager to put the scandal behind them, agreed to all his terms. The agreement was hailed as a landmark victory for police accountability. Mark Thorne, in his arrogant abuse of power, had inadvertently become the catalyst for the most significant law enforcement reform in the state's history. A year later, the landscape of Aspen Creek County had started to change. The new sheriff, a woman recruited from outside the state with a reputation as a reformer, made community policing and de-escalation training mandatory for all deputies. The Civilian Oversight Committee was active and effective, handling complaints with a transparency that slowly began to rebuild public trust. Julian Croft's nature preserve was thriving. The research facility was nearing completion, and the first native bison herd had been successfully reintroduced to the land. He still drove his grandfather's old Ford F-150. He still wore faded jeans and baseball caps. A few of the new deputies had pulled him over in the first few months, seeing the old truck and making the same initial assumption Thorne had. But the encounters were different now. They were polite. They were professional. They stated their reason for the stop and, upon seeing his license and recognizing the name, would often offer a respectful, if slightly embarrassed, apology. They knew who he was, not just as the billionaire who owned the old Henderson place, but as the man who had held their department accountable. He had shown them that the badge was not a shield, but a responsibility. One crisp autumn afternoon, Julian was driving down that same access road where it had all started. He saw a deputy has a young family in a minivan pulled over. Julian slowed his truck, watching in his rearview mirror. He saw the deputy approach the window with a smile. He saw him hand a coloring book to a child in the back seat. He saw a friendly, respectful interaction that ended with the minivan driving away. No ticket issued. It was a small moment, but it was a sign. The culture was changing. Julian smiled. He drove on, heading toward the heart of his property. A quiet man who had used a moment of injustice not for revenge, but to build a better, fairer world in his small corner of it. This story is a powerful reminder of how easily power can be abused, but it also shows us how one person's refusal to be intimidated can spark monumental change. The core of Sheriff Thorne's downfall wasn't just his prejudice. It was his deep-seated insecurity. He saw Julian Croft's old truck and simple clothes not just as out of place, but as a personal insult to the carefully constructed, high-status world he desperately wanted to belong to. His aggression was a defense mechanism, a way to assert his value by devaluing someone else. When confronted with Julian's unshakable calm, his ego couldn't handle it, and he spiraled, breaking law after law to prove a point that was only important in his own mind. What if Julian had acted differently? What if he had been angry and argumentative from the start? It likely would have ended with him being arrested. Just as Thorne wanted, his wealth would have eventually secured his release. But the situation would have been messier. His word against the sheriff's. His superpower in that moment wasn't his money, it was his composure. He understood that in a confrontation with a man high on his own authority, the calmest person in the room is the one who truly holds the power. He let Thorne build his own coffin, and then simply handed him the final nail. The lesson here is profound. Justice should not be a luxury item, accessible only to those who can afford it. Julian Croft was able to triumph because he had the resources to fight back on a massive scale. His lasting legacy, however, was in using those resources to build a system that gave everyone a fighting chance. He didn't just win his own battle, he armed others for theirs. We must all strive to create a world where a person's rights are not dependent on their zip code, the car they drive, or the balance in their bank account. What do you think? Was firing Thorne and revoking his license enough, or should he have faced jail time for his actions? How do you think you would have reacted in Julian's shoes during that initial confrontation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And please don't forget to subscribe. Your voice matters as we continue to explore these stories.